Hey everyone, it's Colin, how's it going? Early in the 90s, during the infancy of laptop computing, having to make compromises was normal. Machines typically had small screens and less than stellar performance. Towards the end of the decade, though, portable computing had reached a point of being able to actually replace desktops. This time, let's take a look at one laptop that didn't exactly follow the trend. Apple's PowerBook 2400C was designed to provide serious performance, but in a package that was compact and highly mobile. It was released in May of 1997, just a few months after another model, the PowerBook Duo 2300C, was discontinued. That machine was the last of Apple's dedicated sub-notebook line, and while the 2400 wasn't compatible with the Duo series of docking stations and peripherals, it was clearly meant to be its spiritual successor of sorts. It featured an active matrix LCD with a resolution of 800 by 600, but it was only 10.4 inches in size. And along with that smaller screen, the machine's footprint was compact as well. Its keyboard, for example, was only 87% of full size. While typing on it definitely took some getting used to, in general it went over okay with owners because of its excellent key feel. And not only was the laptop small, its power adapter didn't take up as much space as others either. But unlike a lot of other sub-notebooks, the 2400 had a full set of ports. On the back was ADB for keyboard or mouse, power input, a serial port, floppy drive connector, a standard VGA video output, and 30-pin SCSI for things like hard drives and scanners. There were also two PCMCIA card slots for expansion, along with an infrared port for short-distance data transfer with things like PDAs. The audio in and out jacks were conveniently placed on the left side, and the machine supported CD-quality stereo sound. But unlike Apple's other full-size PowerBooks, the 2400 didn't have a built-in optical drive, and its floppy drive was external. This made the necessary room inside the machine for its relatively large 29 watt-hour battery, and that lasted for up to 4 hours. Pretty short by today's standards, but respectable for 1997. This particular 2400 seems to have been owned by someone into software development, or at least who was a serious computer nerd. It's running macOS 9.1 instead of the original macOS 7.6 that it shipped with. It has a few typical programs from the era, like Internet Explorer 5, a few shareware games, and an NES emulator with a handful of ROMs, and the MP3 player app SoundJam MP, which was later acquired by Apple to become the basis for iTunes. But it also has a copy of MetroWorks Code Warrior 5, a software development tool that was the most popular option during its era for writing Mac applications. Whoever previously owned this machine did a good job deleting their files and personal data before they got rid of it, but it certainly would have been curious to see what kind of projects they worked on. Perhaps most interesting is that its former owner also used Linux. During startup, an OS picker called BootX launches and gives you the option of continuing with macOS or switching to a Linux installation. Just like with Apple's own Unix-based OS called AUX, the computer has to at least begin to boot macOS in order for the right software prerequisites to be in place to run an alternate OS. And in this case, it's a PowerPC version of Debian 2.2. There were a couple of other Linux distros for Macs at the time, such as YellowDog and MK Linux, but that's a story best saved for another time. This laptop was described as a parts machine when I bought it about a decade ago, but the only thing I could find wrong with it was some damage to the plastic on the back of the screen. There are small spots where it's melted, and so my best guess is that it somehow got splashed with something like acetone. Replacement parts for this machine are really hard to come by, but after searching for a long time, I managed to pick up a spare display assembly. It's missing the LCD panel, but the back is in excellent shape, so I got to work swapping it out. The first thing I did was tackle the rubber bumpers at the top of the screen. They cover a couple of screws and normally pop out, but over time they've turned into sticky goo instead. This is unfortunately common for machines of this age, and it took a bit of work to get it all cleaned up. The same had happened with the feet on the bottom of the machine, so I took the opportunity to deal with those too. Next, I needed to remove the laptop's top panel. I pried up the cover on the right side with a craft knife so I could remove the screw underneath it. Someone's clearly been into this machine before because the cover on the left side was missing entirely. I carefully popped the top cover free using a spudger. This kind of plastic gets brittle with age, so it's important to not break any of the clips. Then this little plastic trim piece came out. It's just held in with pressure from the top cover. I slid the palm rest forward to release some clips, then set it on the keyboard. It was still connected by the trackpad ribbon cable, which I unlatched and disconnected from the motherboard. The keyboard is held in by several screws, which is at least partially what gives it such a solid key feel. Then I could flip it up to expose its two flat flex cables and get them disconnected. I also released this little flex cable, which goes to a small circuit board with the PCMCIA slot eject buttons and infrared transceiver. That board's just held in by two screws. I took out the grounding screw for the display cable and pried up its connectors from the motherboard. There are two exposed screws on the back corners for the screen hinges, and they came out next, followed by two more hinge screws in the front. With those out, I could lift the entire display assembly away from the base. Next, I started to work on disassembling the replacement screen housing. There are screws hidden underneath the badges on the front, but the gap is too small to fit a spudger in there. I had to carefully use the backside of a craft knife to bend them up enough to unhook their latches and pop them free. I got the screws taken out, then removed the two at the top, which were already missing their bumpers. The two halves of the housing are then just held together with plastic clips around the edge, which I delicately released with a spudger, again trying not to break any of them. The housing came with an inverter board, which I didn't need but was happy to keep as a spare. There was a display flex cable as well, which would also come in handy should my original one fail. I took the display off the PowerBook apart the same way. I apparently hadn't gotten quite all the goo out of the top screw holes, and that made removing the screws just a bit more tricky. The LCD panel was held in with a few screws on each side. I disconnected the sleep LED and microphone cables from the inverter board, which I planned on reusing, so I just kept the screen's backlight cable connected. This black plastic piece provides strain relief for the display flex cable, and I unclipped it from the back housing. Then I could lift out the screen and set it aside. I noticed that the hinges on the replacement housing were a bit looser than those on my original, so I set to swap them out. But after I got two of the three screws out of the right hinge on the replacement housing, it came free. Brittle plastic strikes again. Even though these screws went into threaded inserts, the plastic cracked and the insert fell out. I glued the standoff back together and also applied some glue to others that were starting to show cracks. The translucent screen latch, which also houses the sleep LED, was a bit more yellowed on the replacement housing than my original, so I decided to exchange them too. It's spring-loaded, but was pretty easy to slide to one side and remove from the back panel. The other one was just as easy to put in its place, then I could simply route the wires. After the glue dried, I swapped the hinges between the two back panels, and thankfully the repaired standoffs seemed to hold. Then I could start to put the PowerBook back together the same way I had taken it apart. Now, there weren't actually any official instructions for taking the computer apart as far as I had to. Because of its small size and complex construction, Apple required repair centers to send PowerBook 2400s back to a central depot to get fixed. Only straightforward tasks like upgrading RAM and replacing failed keyboards were allowed to be done by service providers. And as for RAM, the machine came with 16 megabytes soldered to the motherboard with one slot for expansion. It used standard EDO laptop modules, and this machine came with a 32 megabyte stick in it, the largest that was commonly available for this model. While it could also take 64 megabyte modules, a design error on the motherboard flipped a couple of pins, so RAM cards that large had to be designed for the 2400, and were therefore less common. The actual maximum RAM upgrade the machine could handle was a 96 megabyte module, which would result in a total of 112 megabytes. These upgrades were very rare though, and also very expensive. There was only one hard drive option, a 1.3 gigabyte IDE unit, and it's something that power users frequently swapped out for something larger. While the 2400's motherboard architecture was based on the high-performing PowerBook 3400, it has one distinct advantage. The CPU is located on a daughter board, which third-party manufacturers took advantage of to offer processor upgrades. The machine shipped with a 180 MHz PowerPC 603E, which performed quite decently for the time, but it wasn't long before a couple of companies offered G3 cards, the most powerful of which was made by Interware and ran at 400 MHz. With the display housing swap finished, there was one other part I wanted to replace on this 2400 while I had it apart. I was browsing on Yahoo Auctions Japan one day and came across a listing for a Japanese keyboard. It was pretty cheap, about $13 US, so I picked it up. There's a few shiny keycaps from use, and it needed a bit of a cleaning, but it was otherwise in good condition. Why a Japanese keyboard? Well, it's because it's fitting, given the 2400's history. You see, the model was designed specifically for sale in Japan, which was Apple's second largest market after the US. Subnotebooks were popular there, and the discontinuation of the Duo 2300 would have left a gap in Apple's product lineup. But instead of designing the 2400 entirely in-house, Apple enlisted help from the Japanese offices of its unlikely business partner through the 90s, IBM. And if you look close enough, you can see its influence. The biggest clue is in the keyboard layout. The 2400 was the first Mac laptop with inverted T arrow keys, which of course were common on ThinkPads. This weird swoopy trackpad button and front-mounted eject buttons for the card slots were also out of place for a PowerBook from this era. There were smaller signs of IBM's work as well, from the frequent sight of IBM part numbers on components to the use of Phillips screws throughout the machine. Apple typically used Torx screws in its laptops. IBM even included a couple of metal strips across the inside of the back display housing. They helped prevent flex, and while they weren't necessary, it was another sign of that company's tendency to build sturdy notebooks. And more than just being designed by IBM in Japan, the PowerBook 2400 was manufactured there too. Now, its price tag of the equivalent of $3,500 US definitely put off some buyers, and sales weren't that great. But to the serious Japanese Mac users, it resonated really well. They felt like Apple had made a computer just for them. The biggest fans of the machine would even periodically get together at conventions like Macworld Tokyo and take a group photo. As with a previous Japan-exclusive PowerBook, the 550C, power users took to customizing their machines. A popular mod was the third-party U-Plan replacement keyboard, which came in a variety of translucent colors. Some owners opted to apply a paint job or vinyl wrap to give their computer a unique look, and a select few went to great lengths and cost to get custom replacement case parts made from translucent plastic. Of course, RAM and CPU upgrade cards helped extend the useful life of the laptops and helped with bragging rights too. There was even a book called the PowerBook 2400C Perfect Guide that showcased modded machines and outlined all the options. So if the 2400 was a Japanese PowerBook, what was mine doing with an English keyboard? Well, interestingly enough, it was also sold in limited quantities in the US, and a comparison of the two keyboards shows just how limited it was. The layout is practically the same, which resulted in a somewhat weird arrangement for a US English keyboard. They simply took the Japanese part, swapped out the keycaps, and blanked out spaces that weren't needed. The PowerBook 2400 was discontinued in the US less than a year after its launch, in March of '98. Though reviews of it were decent, Americans simply wanted bigger screens and more features. A companion PowerBook model, the 3400, garnered much more attention despite being even more expensive. But sales in Japan were strong enough that Apple launched a faster version of the 2400 there, codenamed Mighty Cat, that bumped its 180 MHz processor up to 240. It remained for sale for another 8 months, finally being discontinued at the end of 1998. The mid to late 90s, before Steve Jobs came back, well, that was a very strange time in Apple's history. Lots of turmoil, failed projects, and financial uncertainty. Yet, I tend to think of this period as a sort of golden era for Mac laptops. Rather than force customers to make compromises, there was a model for pretty much everyone, from basic productivity to high performance. The PowerBook 2400 may not have been something the average Mac user needed, but to someone who valued portability and power, the only thing they'd have to give up was a full-size keyboard. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram @thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.